The Alldus podcast is brought to you by Alldus International, supplying your expert AI and digital transformation staffing needs across the US and Europe. Today, you are listening to our AI in Action series, where leading minds in AI from across the world share their story, success, and advice. AI in Action cuts through the hype and explores the true impact of artificial intelligence in our world today.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Samee Zahid. Samee is the engineering lead at Chipper Cash. Samee, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, JP.
It's our pleasure. So, Samee, let's start with a bit of background on yourself. Can you give us an overview of what your journey in technology has been like from where you first got started, some of the roles you've held along the way, and take us up to today as the engineering lead for Chipper?
So yeah, a quick intro into myself. I grew up in Lahore, Pakistan for most of my life. So my first kind of exposure to technology was, seeing how in a country like Pakistan, how quickly, right, technology was, be it from the perspective of internet speeds, be it from the perspective of more people just having mobile phones, right? So that kind of shaped a lot about what technology was before, then I came to the States. I went to a small liberal arts college called Grinnell. This is actually where I met the founders of Chipper as well. And that's where I would say for me, this is back in 2013, I was a first year, seeing that explosion in tech. And it gave me, right, like this idea where I was always, I would say, very aligned with technology and computers. But going in, I was more thinking of measuring economics. And in that year, it was like 2012, 2013, this kind of like how tech is starting to take a larger and larger slice of people's lives. So for me, it became a big thing that you could go in, code up an app and deploy it to hundreds of thousands, millions of users. So got into computer science there, did some internships. The key part was, talking from the perspective of AI was my first summer. I was interning at this startup back in Pakistan called Groupic, and they were doing pretty fun, cool stuff with computer vision, mainly a way to place intelligent ads into video natively. So I was kind of tasked with a lot of like productionization, right? So kind of more like applied ML. And that's where, again, my first exposure to ML and AI, right? And then over the course, I worked at Kifi. That was a startup that got acquired by Google. They did a lot of knowledge curation. It's like a smart bookmark, basically. That's what their offering was. And then going to Yahoo, I interned there, worked on Yahoo Sports. And then right after college, I joined Google. That's where I guess my journey, I would say, really did kickstart. And there I was working on the search ranking team in the geo domain. So working on, helping solve queries like, food near me and showing the best results. And also did like a lot of content-based ranking for reviews. One, I would say the biggest achievement I'd say I had at Google was shipping, a model that was 7-to-1 in terms of win-loss for ranking reviews, which is the ones on Google Maps or search, right? And that was very interesting to me because it was, just me and another engineer, and we were just like shipping this to like up to billions getting affected. So yeah, that's, I think for me was a big learning experience and more, getting into ML. And that's how I ended up chatting with Majid, who's one of the founders at Chipper. Is like, if you want to come and make a data ML team, this is a great opportunity. So yeah, I think a bit, maybe more details, but it gives a nice kind of narrative, right? Like how it came.
Yeah, definitely does. Thank you for sharing. And what really stands out is that you had networked well, and obviously having a connection to the guys at Chipper obviously made the transition that bit easier. But let's talk now all about Chipper. So for anyone who's listening not familiar with Chipper Cash, please explain the business, who you are, what you do, what is the mission of the organization.
So Chipper is what I would call a financial super app serving mainly targeted towards the continent of Africa. So this involves like initially starting off Chipper kind of like a Venmo P2P functionality, which maybe some listeners or people don't know is kind of like the roadmap for a lot of fintechs. Starting off is like, it's a engagement based product. So starting there, but again, the main bits, right, for Chipper, even till today are things like, Forex P2P transfers, right? But then we've started like just launched stocks end of the year, last year. So the ability for Africans to come in and make, buy Tesla stock or any kind of investment of that nature. And then we also have crypto. So, kind of like think of it like a Square Cash app for Africa, essentially.
Very interesting indeed. And obviously, with the market that you're serving, it's huge need and huge potential for the business. Give us some insight then into your role. Obviously, look, you're leading the intelligence team, and there's a heavy use of machine learning with big data problems. So please give us some insight into what it's like behind the scenes, what initially drew you to the role, and what's the day-to-days of the team look like.
Sure. So a bit of background context, right? So when I initially came to, Chipper, less than 15 engineers, I was kind of the main first data hire per se. And I think for a lot of the listeners on this podcast, right, knowing that being the first data hire invites a lot of its own challenges. So I come in and like one of the first things was like getting a data warehouse, right? Like, a lot of the analysis that was going on in data before was just like literally going off of production DBs, people were querying it, like you cannot do any kind of complex analysis, right? So, kind of shifting from that kind of perspective, doing things like ML can take time and doing it in a way that is sustainable and develops with the foundation, right? Like whenever someone talks about ML, the way I like to say is like, how can we not do it without, like, how can we do it without ML, right? Like first to kind of understand the use case and work through that. But today we have a couple of models in production. We have things up and running, and we have a pretty nicely mature pipeline framework we use for folks interested. We have Snowflake for warehousing. We use Dask as our processing engine underneath, and of course it's a Python down the road. And then we use things like Snorkel, Cat Boost to kind of really go in that world. I know Snorkel. I think you've had them on the podcast before, so we're big fans of them.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Yeah, because especially right for us, especially in an uncharted region where you're not going to have people giving you good data. They're not going to be people who are going to have necessarily the same kind of archetype that you might find in Western countries. So a lot of times labeling becomes very tough because it's an issue. So using Snorkel with the ability to label based on rules, like really gave us a leg up, right? So yeah, so a lot of the problems we focus mainly, I would say most of the work today is around growth and risk and fraud, which I like to treat it as like angel and the demon, essentially, because you have compliance and anti-fraud working on things like making bad actors disappear from our platform, and then you have growth who are more geared on getting more people. So it's always an interesting balance, but things like where I'm a big fan of using scoring, right, as a good abstraction to solve a lot of these problems, where things like modeling engagement in a much better way, having an engagement score. We have that. And another model we have is an onboarding score, which is helping us determine the risk level of a user as soon as they onboard. And these are tough problems because what mainly is, right, like the complex piece here is working within regulation, right? Regulation is very unclear in the continent, for instance, around fintech. And that's an emerging, right? We're working with regulators as we do all these things. But the main challenge is making sure we do solve for fraud, but also are compliant. And the world of compliance, probably another full podcast could be devoted to that, but it's essentially very different.
We could
right?
do a series on that if we wanted, Samee. But yeah, you're right.
Exactly. And that's where it gave me insight, right? Like where we have a kind of a lag of sorts where you have innovation, right? You go at tech companies and how things are progressing, but then there this world of finance and compliance, which are like 20-30 years back, like literally almost, right? So it's like, how do we make solutions that are also highly debuggable, transparent, right? So that compliant regulators can also have that context. And things like working with more transparent models, which there's a lot of research that's going on. I was at Google, we work closely with Maya Gupta's team, who are working on this kind of glass box machine learning framework, which lets, right, like debuggability and visibility be a big component in your model life cycle, right? So learning from those things. But like I think the key part why I find working at Chipper very exciting is that you have, somewhat a relatively solved, I mean, it's not a solved problem, but there's a lot of mature literature around fraud and how to tackle fraud. But then you're in a country that might, right, like where users are giving you bad data, providers might be giving funky data. So we need to have our own layer of detection and be a bit creative in how we can ascertain certain things. Another thing that came up that has been, will be a challenging for everyone is like how Apple has made user tracking be very difficult. So that impacts us because things like device fingerprinting and all are very important for fraud. And those challenges also become more complex now in this new world. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting mix of making sure we can marry, right, like your research and your ML and what's state of the art with, the current landscape of what fintech is. And I think that's kind of like a lot of what we do. There are other things, of course, there's a lot of work around operations, right, like liquidity, predicting how amount of float we might have and all those ideas, right? So we're working on them as well as these harder problems. But for me personally, it was also a lot about making sure we could disambiguate like your analytics functions and these more tougher, deeper problems we have to solve in terms of company structure and teams. So, now we're in a phase, we're already doing that, where we're having this analytics organization on its own, geared around, right, like more analytical work. And that's another thing I can definitely get into, is around, right, this evolving
Yeah,
landscape of
please
career.
do. Yeah, 'cause I think it's a nice segue into the team dynamics, the team structure, and how it evolves over time. Like with any startup, you've got to be agile, but you've also got to know what you're going to need a few steps ahead. So it'd be good to learn from yourself what the journey has been like since you've joined, and what you learn from working at an organization as big as Google that's helped you in this new world of a startup environment.
So one thing, right, like by being at a place like Google, you kind of see, right, how, the end state, right, like how things should be, how good things should be, how much people will be complaining about certain systems. Even at a place like Google, it will, come as a surprise, right? Like you would think a place like Google, you have your developer tools, and in general, like it's still a constant state of progress, but it gives you an idea where you want to be. And then you come to a place like Chipper, going super fast. So you don't have the liberty to build for 10 years. You have to be fast. So it's kind of, right, you have to employ a bit more of this kind of strategy of like what, it's like playing like Lego, right? What pieces to kind of use in your overall strategy, because sometimes it might be better to buy a certain component, right, in your strategy, or it might be better to do it very fast, maybe build a system that lives for 6 months, right, with that amount of scale in your head, as a way to explore the problem before you fully set on a way to fully productionize it. So I think like going to the structure, very clear, right? Engineering is the thread here, right? And as you see, like a lot of places start off with the data function being analyst, scientist oriented. And that kind of already divorces, right, the ability to embed things like ML and into your app. So a lot of the things that I saw, especially at Google, was like how engineers were very involved in the product, making changes that would literally impact end users. And then you would have like data scientists and analysts kind of geared around more like business needs, right? Like things like churn, retention on the growth side, making sure your metrics are well defined, which I feel like is one of the highest impact things, right, a growing organization can do, is have your metrics be well defined and documented and be visible and transparent across the company. So those are more like, I would say, analyst scientist things, right, where you're also then doing more deep dives into one-offs. And then we have this ML engineer, which is somewhat of a new, right, like emergence over the last few years. Because if you go 10 years ago, if I was building this team, I don't even know if it would be possible, to be honest, to do this at a startup, because the abstraction afforded to engineers was pretty minuscule compared to today, right? Like, if you want to develop a model, there's so many things you have to do before that. We have AWS, we have a lot of services, like we have, Snowflake today, which we didn't really have great data warehouses 10 years ago. Like you're still in the data lake world, and you needed to literally staff a team that would get to a place where Snowflake, now you go in, sign a contract, hook it in, and you're done, right? Does not mean that there's no more work around the meta management of something like Snowflake, but it is orders of magnitude less than if you were to build it yourself or something similar. So that level of abstraction, which is just a general broader trend in technology, right? It's going from low level to high level. We saw in languages, going from binary, basic, to things like Python, and soon to be like something like prompt programming, which we already see with something like GPT-3, where you kind of prime like a system to think in a certain way, to act in a certain way, and that's how you code. So that's another topic of discussion in a more broader sense. But for us, it's been important to, right, make sure we are really up to date with trends in the industry, because a lot of the times, right, like you could save a lot of work by not reinventing the wheel, using a library or something. And like things like ML ops is fast growing, right? Like this entire world of how you should manage your models and how you should train them. Like Databricks, of course, is is kind of like the extreme on one side, where it's one-stop shop, which is a great use case for a lot of companies too. So I think just the broader data, right, like industry in terms of career path, in terms of products and tools, and it's just like very fast, right? So it's important to make sure you can have this nice mix of what you can buy and what you can build, and keeping your company timelines in mind. And so it's a lot of a juggling act from that side. But
absolutely.
That's what I would say is, at least for me, is like a big day-to-day is making sure we're executing on these projects with that. And, if there's other things we have headroom in, why not? And then seeing if that's better to buy or better to punt it later or do it right now. So.
Yeah.
You are listening to the Alldus podcast. When you're looking to scale your team, or if you are interested in showcasing your company in a future episode, reach out today. Or if you're in the market for a new role, visit our website to view open positions, www.alldus.com.
Look, I'm sure a lot of your role is a mix of the here and now, but also trying to be prepared for whatever's coming down the line. And you already touched on a lot of the rapid evolution of machine learning. I mean, ML ops, that feels like it's just sprung up in the past few years, where 4 or 5 years ago it wasn't a coined phrase. Focusing now on the next chapter for Chipper Cash, you guys have obviously done a tremendous job in a short space of time, and feels like you're only just scratching the surface of possibilities. With that, I'm sure there's going to be continued growth. Can you give us some insight into what the next year to 2 years look like at Chipper Cash? And with the continued growth, what opportunities are there going to be for people who are interested in what you're doing, whether they have a background in analytics or AI, machine learning? Because the mission is one that's a lot of people will want to get behind.
Yeah, the way I like to see it is still like pretty much day zero for us. I feel like we're still so early, and like usually a lot of people like to say it, right? Like it could be 3 years from IPO and they're like, oh, we're still day zero. Yes. And for a lot of companies, that's true. But for us, we're a bit unique because the ceiling is pretty high, right? Like you're literally tackling the problem of financial infrastructure, getting on-ramp, off-ramp solved for users in Africa. And there's a really nice piece that was being circulated around Twitter like last year around Africa as well, right? In terms of population growth and how it's doing. And, it's soon to eclipse, soon as I mean like 2030, 2040, eclipse the population of India and China combined, right? So like I said, it's like still day zero. Like we're operational, not all our products are operational in all the markets we're in, but we're operational in like 7, 8 markets. We've, also launched in the US, UK, we have Canada, Australia also on the horizon, mainly from a remittance, right, like strategical perspective of getting the African diaspora. But it's also, right, making sure that we can plant our flags as quickly as possible so that all the regulation and the paperwork and licensing work can be done so that we can start executing. And that's a lot still left to do because Africa on its own is massive. If you just focus on Africa, which is also, if you just, but it's insane. Like if Chipper can be like a top 5 fintech in Africa by the end of the decade, that's a home run, right? That's not a home, that's like the moon shot. So
yeah, that's the World Series, not just one swing. They won the entire, you've won the whole
exactly.
competition.
Exactly. But, in that sense, we're good. We're, the entire thing with us is like growing as fast as we can at a manageable pace and then keep on working. There's like product lines to be added. There's like, stuff to be done. And, if you think about it, the pace is also crazy. I joined Chipper in October of 2020. So it's been around a year and a half for me. And when I joined, like I said, engineers were like 13. And today we're already like more like 40, 50 and 100 by the end of the year, right? So the pace, it's a bit jarring for sure. I will say that it's a learning experience because a lot of things your processes have to change as you grow. But from the perspective of where we are today, this is like the first innings, right? Is how I like to see it.
Yeah, and then on the second part of that is the potential hiring. There are definitely going to be people listening to this who are interested in being a part of the mission. So what opportunities will there be for engineers, data scientists, machine learning folk to come on board and join over the year and into next year?
Yes, I would encourage people to check out our careers page. That has usually the most up-to-date things. But if anyone listening to this is, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or my email. And we're definitely looking for folks, right, geared with some fintech or payments experience, working either as a data scientist, M engineer. We're also hiring for more management in this domain. We're trying to build out, invest heavily in this side. And then we're also looking for staff, right? Like people who can come in and lead, because we have a lot of different problems, right? Like I said, a lot of it's tabular data, I will say, but there's also a big piece around graphs, right? As a fintech modeling payments, graphs are a big thing. So we've gotten started on that, but it's going to be its own team of people right now. It's just someone exploring and building it, right? We have computer vision problems too, a lot of identity verification bits, which currently we're using providers, but we want to start investing in that so that, we can start hopefully eating into that at some point, not be fully reliant on like having, let's say, 7 different KYC providers to do document verification across 15 countries we're in. So yeah, in terms of that, the kind of data, I think it's I would also tell that to folks, is a lot of different problems that we want to solve. And if you're interested, definitely reach out. For new grads and interns too, I would say that we're looking we most likely will be looking for interns in the summer, but I want to already say it so that if any interested folks who are looking, reach out. There might not be an opening yet, but again, reach out to me. We can sort it as well.
Excellent. Samee, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today. The mission at Chipper Cash is so cool, and the sky is the limit for the impact that you guys can have. So I look forward to us doing another interview in a few years just to see how far along you guys are. And we wish you the best of luck in your journey. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, JP. And thanks for all the thoughtful questions. And I hope everyone got something out of this.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alldus podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any Android podcast of choice. You can also head over to our website, www.alldus.com, to listen to more podcasts, view our open roles, and stay up to date with industry news. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more great episodes coming very soon.